At 2:03 a.m. off the southern tip of Florida, an unmarked vessel slipped through U.S. waters like a predator in the dark. No lights, no radio. Just a 60-foot black hull cutting across the sea low and fast. It was the kind of boat you never wanted to see, but by the time you did, it was already too late. Back at a sleepy Coast Guard station in Key West, alarms didn't blare. No one shouted. But one old officer, Carl Simmons, retired Navy Silver Star on his coat, stood up from his desk and said just 5 words. "Wake up, Washington. Now." Because this wasn't a fishing boat. This was Luis Ortega, Venezuela's most feared cartel commander, launching an armed infiltration onto American soil. A man responsible for over 300 deaths. And tonight, he was coming here. But Ortega's deadliest mistake wasn't crossing the border. His mistake was thinking America wouldn't fight back. He had no idea that a woman named Karoline Leavitt, 27 years old, underestimated, unarmed, and smarter than every man in his crew, was already watching him from a secured White House terminal. Her voice came across the encrypted line like ICE Initiate Echo Protocol. "We take them alive. What happened over the next 4 hours would stun a nation. And it wouldn't take bullets. It would take strategy, technology, and the steely will of a woman the cartel never saw coming. Because this wasn't just an incursion. It was the moment a cartel met its match on American ground. The digital map glowed in icy blue, humming quietly in the Situation Room beneath the White House. Karoline Leavitt stood with her arms folded tight, her brow tense but composed. On the giant screen, a red dot. Luis Ortega's boat had just breached the 12-mile line, slipping into American waters like a serpent in the night. The room was silent, thick with the weight of what was unfolding. Intelligence officials some twice Karoline's age sat glued to her words. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. Her confidence came from precision. "Patch in Lieutenant Commander Jeff Harris from NAS Key West," she said, her voice low and steady. Within seconds, Harris's face filled the screen. Salt and pepper hair, creased brow, and the look of a man who's seen war and survived it. "We've got him in range," Harris confirmed. "But we'll need green light authorization." "You sure this is the guy?" Karoline didn't flinch. "That's Luis Ortega, confirmed by facial recognition and satellite heat signatures. 3 armed men on board. Hidden compartments. The plan is not to sink him. We need him alive." That last line drew a few glances. Ortega wasn't just a cartel leader. He was the spider at the center of a bloody web that stretched from Caracas to Chicago. Bringing him in alive could unravel the entire network. But it also meant risk. Big risk. The kind of risk most 27-year-olds don't dare take. But Karoline wasn't most 27-year-olds. She turned to her aide, a sharp ex-CIA analyst named Tom Bledsoe, and asked calmly, "Has the container arrived in the Keys?" Tom nodded. "Placed exactly where you said. Abandoned shrimp plant off Flagler Ave. All wired. Cameras live. Backup teams on standby." Trap was set. This was not going to be a raid at sea. No, Karoline had predicted Ortega's next move days ago. Based on shipping manifests, social media chatter, intercepted texts from a burner phone in Miami, she'd put it all together. Ortega wasn't just smuggling in weapons or drugs tonight. He was coming to meet someone. Someone in the United States government. And Karoline was about to find out who. After 12:37 a.m. Key West. The old shrimp processing plant had been out of operation since 2015. Its rusted machinery still clung to salt and time. The perfect place for a covert meetup. Inside, hidden beneath crates behind false walls and high in the rafters, Echo Team waited. Veterans from SEAL Team 6, 1 ex-Marine sniper, a cyber intelligence specialist working off a single tablet. And at the center of it all, Karoline's command: no lethal force, unless absolutely necessary, because what she really needed tonight was information. and Ortega's arrogance. At 12:54 a.m. the boat pulled in. No sound but the gentle lapping of waves against the wooden dock. 3 figures emerged. Ortega was in the middle, dressed in a dark blazer, a smug expression on his face as he adjusted his Rolex. He was met by another man, a man in a gray suit, mid-40s, clean cut, the type that looked more at home on Capitol Hill than in a dockyard at midnight. Karoline watched through a live satellite feed. Her heart didn't race. Her breath didn't catch. She just leaned in closer, her mind calculating everything, every gesture, every word. When Ortega smiled and handed over a flash drive, the man in the suit said only one word: payment. Ortega laughed. Double, or I walk. And that's when Karoline spoke into her comms. Now, the takedown, like a switch, had been flipped. Echo team descended. Ropes from the ceiling. Floodlights burst on. Ortega froze. The man in the suit pulled a sidearm, but before he could raise it, he was face down in the dirt with a boot on his neck. Ortega didn't resist. He grinned. "You think this changes anything?" he sneered. "I have more men, more friends, even in your government." Karoline didn't respond. She didn't need to. Instead, she walked calmly to the situation screen and turned to Agent Bledsoe. "Play the file," she said. On screen, a surveillance video, dated 2 nights prior. Ortega in a Zoom call with the very man he just met, Congressman Harold Mason, a name no one expected. A man who'd publicly denounced the cartel, now seen arranging logistics for tonight's arrival. The room gasped. A senior official whispered, "This is treason." But Karoline wasn't done. She leaned forward and quietly added, "And we have more." The fallout. By sunrise, Ortega was in federal custody. The congressman had been arrested by 600 a.m., his D.C. townhouse swarming with agents. Karoline didn't gloat. She didn't tweet. She didn't even go home to sleep. Instead, she walked into the West Wing press room and faced a dozen cameras. "I know some of you think I'm too young for this job," she began. "Too inexperienced. Too unqualified." She paused. "But last night we stopped a foreign cartel operation on U.S. soil. We exposed a federal official aiding that operation. And we did it without firing a single shot. That's the America I believe in." The room went silent. Then a single reporter, an older man from the Boston Globe, stood up slowly and asked Miss Leavitt, "What drives you?" Karoline blinked. And then with quiet clarity she said, "My grandfather flew a B-17 over Normandy. My father ran a small gas station for 30 years. I grew up knowing that real power doesn't come from wealth or age, it comes from truth, courage, and doing what's right when nobody else will." Back at the shrimp plant. One last detail. Before the agents cleared the scene, one of the Echo team members, Corporal Dan McGuire, called something out. "Ma'am," he radioed, "you're going to want to see this." Behind a fake wall in Ortega's boat, agents discovered 6 black duffel bags, each filled with untraceable firearms cache, and 3 handwritten letters addressed to officials in Arizona, New York, and Massachusetts. The implication was clear. This wasn't a one-time deal. It was a network, and Karoline had only just opened the first door. As Karoline finally stepped outside, the early morning sun casting gold across the south lawn, her phone buzzed. A single message. Unknown number. 4 words. "You weren't supposed to win." She stared at it, then smiled. "Watch me," she whispered. Because this wasn't just a victory. It was a declaration. America was awake, and she was just getting started. By the time dawn broke over Washington, D.C., the calm, golden light of morning had no chance of softening what Karoline Leavitt was about to face. The West Wing, once her fortress of order and message discipline, had turned into something more like a chessboard of shifting loyalties. After the success of Operation Echo in Key West, where Karoline had brilliantly orchestrated a sting, that exposed Luis Ortega, one of the most elusive cartel messengers in the Western Hemisphere. One might expect celebration. Instead, a chilling message arrived through a secure channel at 6:17 a.m. It read, "You weren't supposed to win. No sender, no metadata. Just 6 words that landed like a cold slap in the face." The message didn't frighten her. It insulted her, because now she understood someone on the inside had counted on her to fail. As she walked into the secure morning briefing with President Trump and the national security team, she carried more than a flash drive. She carried a storm. She recounted everything with the sharp clarity of someone who had stayed up through the night. The drug routes buried in the documents, the port coordinates encrypted in Ortega's sat phone, and the video showing Ortega meeting with someone who looked suspiciously like Congressman Harold Mason. The room grew tense. Trump leaned forward, hands folded, eyes fixed. "You trust your team?" he asked. The pause that followed told them everything they needed to know, because deep in her gut, Karoline had begun to suspect something no patriot ever wants to believe, that betrayal was not knocking at the door. It had already walked in. 2 days prior, she'd noticed something minor but odd. A login, using her own secure credentials, had pinged at 2:43 a.m. from a private residence in Arlington, Virginia. At first, she chalked it up to a digital misfire. But now, in light of the leaked press coverage, trying to spin Operation Echo as unlawful vigilante action, Karoline's instincts screamed otherwise. She reran the access logs with DHS Trace software. The device used was registered to Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Wilkins, a trusted colleague, a friend, a woman who had toasted her birthday just 2 weeks ago with a slice of peach cobbler in the Rose Garden. The same woman who now sat behind her desk, as if nothing had happened. Karoline didn't make a scene. She entered Sarah's office, calmly closing the door behind her. Her tone was even controlled. "Why did your credentials access my terminal at 2:43 a.m. Monday?" The smile fell from Sarah's face, replaced by a stillness that was almost theatrical. "Karoline," she said, her voice delicate like glass, "think carefully about what you're implying." But it was no longer an implication. Within the hour, Sarah sat in a confidential inquiry room with DOJ observers and 2 White House cyber analysts. The truth unraveled like a bad ribbon. Sarah was connected to a shadow group called the Horizon Collective, a quiet but powerful network embedded across federal agencies, justifying its existence as a check and balance force after the 2016 election. But ideology had soured into sabotage. Sarah admitted reluctantly that she had passed on limited files. "Harmless logistics," she said. But Karoline knew better. Logistics don't get cartel leaders through our ports undetected. Logistics don't trigger 6-word warnings from invisible enemies. And then, as if perfectly timed, mainstream media exploded. Headlines accusing Karoline of leading an unsanctioned federal raid dominated cable news. White House Press Secretary goes rogue, the chyron read. The hashtags, #Leavitt lawless and #PressSec power trip were suddenly everywhere. Karoline saw the coordination instantly. This wasn't just political backlash. It was an organized campaign. The same group feeding Ortega was now feeding stories to the press. She marched to the Oval Office, placed the flash drive on the president's desk, and laid out her plan. "They want to twist the truth. We give America the whole picture. I'm going to hold a live press conference. Not a filtered one, not off the record. I'm playing the tape, naming names and showing every ounce of proof. Let the country decide who's rogue." Trump gave her the nod she needed. Let it rip. By 6:00 p.m., America watched as Karoline stood behind the White House press podium with nothing but raw data and unshakable calm. She revealed footage of Ortega's capture, his confession implicating Congressman Mason, the satellite images of drug drops at Miami shipping yards, and even audio clips of Sarah Wilkins entering classified databases after hours. She didn't flinch. Her voice didn't waver. She closed the presentation with this line: "The threat to our republic does not always wear camouflage or speak with a foreign accent. Sometimes it sits in meetings beside us, smiling, nodding, waiting to strike when it thinks we won't fight back. But we will." And we just did. The room, stunned into silence, slowly erupted in applause. Reporters who had come expecting scandal left with storylines of courage. Even skeptical outlets began airing the full footage. Overnight, the online tide turned. The hashtags flipped. Now it was hashtag Karoline was right, and exposed the network. Thousands of Americans, many in their 60s and 70s, flooded comment sections and call-ins saying they hadn't felt this proud of a public servant in years. The story wasn't just one of national security. It was one of moral clarity, generational pride, and sheer defiance in the face of shadowy corruption. And just when she thought the dust had settled at nearly midnight, a knock came on her office door. It was General Wade Harrison, retired, decorated, legendary in defense circles. He hadn't set foot in the West Wing in years. He entered without formal greeting, placed a folder on her desk, and said, "You're in it now, Miss Leavitt. The Horizon Collective isn't a side project. It's a hydra. You just cut off one head." Karoline looked at the folder: satellite surveillance, finance flows, code words embedded in diplomatic cables. On top was a name: Senator Graham Colby, Judiciary Oversight Committee. Status high risk. She exhaled, then smiled faintly. "Then let's shine the light," she whispered. "Not at midnight this time. In broad daylight." The morning after her bombshell press conference, Karoline Leavitt didn't wake up to applause or flowers. She woke up to silence, the kind of silence that makes your gut tighten. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of something waiting. The streets outside the White House were quiet, but the intel feeds were pulsing. Threat detection had spiked overnight. Someone had triggered a data burst from an embassy server in Brussels. The Horizon Collective was moving, and at the center of that movement, the name General Harrison had left in that classified folder now glared like a loaded gun: Senator Graham Colby. For decades, Colby had presented himself as a moderate, a careful man of measured words, always straddling the aisle with a practiced smile. But Karoline had seen enough theater to know the difference between an actor and a patriot. The folder revealed encrypted communications, travel overlaps with known Horizon donors, and something else: documents he had personally blocked from being subpoenaed during an oversight hearing 2 years prior. The content of those documents: names of federal judges suspected of collusion with transnational intelligence fronts. And Karoline wasn't about to let that go. She moved fast. At 10:12 a.m., she walked into the Eisenhower Executive Office building, where an emergency strategy briefing with national security and DOJ officials had just begun. She didn't wait for permission. She laid down the folder, pointed at Colby's name, and said, "He's the leak. He's the guardian of this network. And he's about to walk into a Judiciary Committee hearing like nothing's wrong." The Attorney General, Linda Whitmore, looked stunned for a moment before nodding slowly. "Then let's make sure he doesn't walk out the same way." But they needed proof, a kind that couldn't be spun or silenced. Enter Robert Bobby Kendall, a former NSA cryptographer turned whistleblower now living in seclusion in Montana. Kendall had once worked on an AI-enhanced surveillance system designed to identify digital anomalies in foreign state communication. But when that same system was diverted by Colby's staffers to monitor political opponents and journalists, Kendall walked away and took a copy of the logs with him. Logs showing private meetings between Senator Colby and Horizon operatives in Berlin, Toronto, and Dubai. Meeting notes disguised as environmental reports. Conversations embedded in metadata. It was all there. Karoline and a 2-man security team boarded a private DOJ jet to meet Kendall on a snow-dusted airstrip outside Bozeman. The man who stepped onto the tarmac was worn, but alert. His words were sharp, slow, and deliberate. You expose Colby now, you're not just burning him, you're lighting up everyone he covered for. You ready for that? Karoline didn't blink. I'm not here to make smoke, she said. I'm here to bring the fire. With the encrypted drive in hand, she returned to D.C. and prepared for what would become the most daring move of her public career, confronting a sitting U.S. senator on live television during a nationally broadcast Judiciary Committee hearing. At exactly 9:00 a.m. the next morning, she arrived at Capitol Hill, not as a press secretary but as a sworn witness under oath carrying evidence the nation hadn't even imagined existed. The cameras rolled. The room was packed with press skeptics and defenders of the old guard. Colby opened the session with his usual syrupy voice, pretending cordiality. Miss Leavitt, we're here to address concerns over your recent, shall we say, extra-legal endeavors. The smirk on his face was almost theatrical. Karoline smiled politely, opened her folder, and calmly began. Senator Colby, before we go further, I'd like to submit into the official record a flash drive containing data logs from a decommissioned NSA project logs that show your location history, communication records, and file suppression orders dating back 6 years. These files connect you to operatives involved in the Horizon Collective, and they've already been verified by DOJ forensics. The room exploded. Microphones crackled. Reporters shouted. One senator actually stood up in disbelief. But Karoline didn't stop. She pressed a small remote, and the screen behind her lit up with satellite overlays of Colby's Berlin rendezvous. Next slide, an audio file of Colby instructing an aide to erase any tie between Horizon and domestic judicial assets. Then the coup de grace, an email with Colby's own digital signature, authorizing funds routed through a heritage outreach fund to Horizon-linked shell NGOs. Colby's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. His voice cracked for the first time in years. This is a coordinated attack by fringe elements in the administration, he stammered. But it was too late. DOJ agents entered the chamber. Linda Whitmore, dressed in black and walking like judgment itself, approached the bench and handed Colby a formal subpoena. The crowd gasped. Senator Colby, you are under investigation for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding a foreign-influenced intelligence network. You will surrender your devices and vacate your position effective immediately. Outside, the crowd roared. Protesters had gathered overnight, their signs once skeptical, now full of praise. Truth has a name. Karoline Leavitt. Cable news networks, initially critical, now ran segments titled "The Young Woman Who Took on the Senate." Seniors called into talk radio shows saying they hadn't seen such grit in Washington since the Reagan era. One caller from Des Moines, 74-year-old Martha Lane, broke down in tears as she said, "This young lady reminded me why I believed in this country in the first place." Karoline didn't bask in the attention. She stood quietly as Colby was escorted out. As he passed her, he muttered bitterly, "You think this is over?" She looked him in the eye. "No," she said. "This is just where the light starts shining." That night, Karoline walked the halls of the White House alone. The same halls that had once intimidated her, now echoing with a new kind of purpose. A staffer handed her a note. It was from Kendall, the NSA whistleblower. It read, "One more thing. Colby wasn't the top. He answered to a council. I'll show you. But you need to decide how far are you willing to go." She folded the note slowly, looked out over the glowing lights of D.C. and whispered, "All the way." It all started with a note. A plain, handwritten slip of paper handed to Karoline Leavitt by Kendall, the quiet insider who helped bring down Senator Colby. The words were short, but they hit like a thunderclap. Colby wasn't the top. He answered to a council. "I'll show you. But you need to decide how far are you willing to go." Karoline sat still in her White House office, holding that note like it was made of fire. Outside the window, the Washington skyline glowed in the early night. But in her mind, the shadows grew deeper. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge or one bribed senator. If Kendall was right, the roots of this ran far deeper into something darker, more dangerous. She folded the note, placed it in her jacket, and whispered to herself, "If this council exists, they're about to meet me." By sunrise, she was back on a secure jet heading for Montana. But this time, she wasn't flying in with the press or a task force. Just one Secret Service agent, 2 encrypted laptops, and resolve like steel. Kendall met her at an abandoned ranger station in the northern woods. He looked more nervous now, pale, twitchy, constantly scanning the trees. Without a word, he handed her an old metal lockbox. "They'll know we met again. I don't have much time." Inside the box were USB drives, tattered files, and a folder labeled Council, Core Intel. Karoline opened it slowly. What she found sent chills down her spine. There were names, people she'd seen on television, people with power. Photos, flight records, internal memos, a map with red pins across Washington, Zurich, London. And in every file, one strange emblem appeared, a black circle with 13 interlocking stars. Kendall spoke in a low voice. "These aren't politicians. They're former CIA, billionaire donors, tech giants, judges, media tycoons. For 20 years, they've manipulated everything from nominations to verdicts. Malloy was one of theirs. So was Whitaker. And Colby. He was just a messenger." Karoline couldn't believe it. This was no conspiracy theory. It was documented, organized, calculated. A secret council above the courts, above the press, above the people. She flew back to D.C. the same night, heart pounding, hands gripping the lockbox like it held the Constitution itself. At 11:40 p.m., she called for an emergency meeting with Attorney General Linda Whitmore and National Intelligence Director Thomas Keane. What was supposed to be a quick check-in turned into a 3-hour war room session. By 3:17 a.m., the room was dead silent. Whitmore finally broke it. "Are you telling us there's a secret council influencing the entire judicial system?" Karoline stared straight ahead. "No. I'm showing you." The evidence spoke for itself. Wire transfers, coded communications, surveillance footage. Karoline didn't need to convince anyone. She just needed them to see. Director Keane leaned forward. "We've heard rumors, bits and pieces, but never this. Not this complete. This dangerous." Karoline nodded. "Then we go public, not behind closed doors. The people deserve to know." The next 72 hours were a blur. Cyber experts cracked open encrypted files. DOJ investigators linked bank accounts to fake nonprofits. And Karoline, with fire in her veins, pieced it all into a single picture. They had everything. A payment from a pharma lobbyist to a green fund. Emails joking about buying a federal ruling. A video grainy but clear of a Zurich meeting where members plotted how to bury headlines. By Friday, Karoline stood in front of the U.S. District Courthouse in Washington, surrounded by cameras, the Capitol behind her. No script. No teleprompter. Just the truth. For too long, we've been told corruption hides in alleys and shadows. But what if I told you it's sitting in boardrooms, on magazine covers, pulling strings behind the judges we're told to trust? Today, I present proof, undeniable, irrefutable, that a secret council has manipulated our courts, silenced voices, and eroded justice. The crowd gasped. Reporters dropped their pens. Live feeds across America lit up. Karoline raised her voice. "They tried to find me, shame me, bury me in court. But they made one mistake. I don't back down, and I never will." From across the street, someone shouted, "We're with you, Karoline." Then another, and another. The applause that followed was thunder. Not staged, not polite, just pure American outrage and hope. Across the country, people tuned in. Elderly veterans in Ohio stood from their recliners and saluted. Grandmothers in Florida watched through tears. A trucker in Arkansas pulled over on I-40 and whispered, "She's one of us." Hashtags exploded online. Expose the council. Karoline Leavitt the third justice is coming. But the council was watching too. 2 days later, Karoline's White House badge stopped working. Her GPS was hijacked, sending her SUV into a restricted zone. A surveillance drone flew over her apartment in Alexandria. Director Keene pulled her aside with grim eyes. "They know. You're a threat now." Karoline didn't blink. Good. That means they're scared. She knew the next move had to be bold, loud, unmistakable. She called for a public federal hearing televised nationwide. It hadn't been done since Watergate, and this time the witnesses were victims of judicial sabotage. Retired clerks, silenced attorneys, and Kendall, the man who risked everything to speak. Karoline didn't stand as an official. She stood as an American citizen who refused to let evil hide behind robes and rules. As the hearing closed, she looked into the camera not at politicians, not at the press, but at the people you tried to silence me in court. You mocked me on the bench. But I'm not the generation that bows. I am the generation that breaks ceilings and shines a light on what's been hiding in the dark. The trial isn't over. It's just beginning. And this time, you're the jury. Across the country, silence turned into thunder, and far away in a room without windows sealed by steel and silence, 13 powerful figures watched her on a massive screen. One of them, in a dark suit and colder eyes, leaned forward and growled, "We underestimated her. That was our last mistake." The morning sun rose over Washington, D.C., casting long golden rays on the white stone of the Capitol dome. But inside the halls of justice, a storm was gathering. It wasn't on any forecast. It had no wind, no thunder, but it would be felt in every courtroom across America. Karoline Leavitt stood tall outside the federal tribunal building, just blocks from the White House, surrounded by a sea of reporters and supporters. Her voice had been heard in every state. Her evidence had shaken the pillars of power. And now the final day had come. A special grand jury had been impaneled. 13 members chosen not for politics but for integrity were tasked with reviewing the mountain of evidence Karoline had presented. Evidence of a secret council operating above the law, infiltrating the judicial system, rigging rulings, silencing whistleblowers. This day would not be a trial. It would be a reckoning. Inside the grand hall, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Karoline sat at the front, dressed not in a power suit but in the same simple blazer she wore when she first entered this fight. A symbol, a statement, that she was still the same woman who had been fined for wearing a cross, the same woman who stood alone against biased judges, the same woman who refused to be broken. The jurors took their seats. U.S. Marshal Gray called the room to order. Attorney General Linda Whitmore rose first, outlining the scope of the inquiry. As she spoke, screens lit up with classified memos, bank records, aerial surveillance, and the now infamous Zurich meeting video. Then came the witnesses, court clerks who had seen cases reassigned, journalists whose articles had been buried. One by one, the truth emerged like a rising tide, and then the room fell silent. Karoline stood, not with notes, not with a script, with truth. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady, "I'm not here to win. I'm here to wake America up. We were told to trust the system. But what happens when the system gets hacked from the inside? What happens when justice gets auctioned off behind closed doors?" She walked slowly across the marble floor. "This isn't about politics. This isn't about me. It's about what kind of country we leave behind. Do we want our grandchildren judged by courts run by secret councils? Do we want truth filtered through people who think they're untouchable?" A hush filled the room. Even the cameras paused. Karoline reached into her folder and held up a photo. One of the council members shaking hands with a federal judge who had sentenced a veteran to 10 years for exposing corruption. This is real. This is happening. And I need you to draw a line. The jurors didn't blink. They rose. Each took a piece of paper, and one by one they wrote. It took less than 20 minutes. But it felt like 20 hours. When they returned, Marshal Gray unfolded the verdict. By unanimous vote, the council known as Directive 13 is found to be operating outside the law. An immediate federal injunction is issued against all affiliated members' assets frozen, and a joint DOJ-FBI task force is to commence arrests within 48 hours. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Karoline lowered her head. Justice had spoken. Across the nation, courthouse TVs played the verdict. In small towns and big cities, Americans watched as names were read aloud. Bankers, tech moguls, judges, editors, all part of a network that believed they were above the Constitution. But the verdict didn't just expose them. It empowered us. In Oregon, a retired Vietnam vet saluted the screen. In Kentucky, a school teacher hugged her husband through tears. In Texas, a family gathered in prayer around their TV whispering, "Finally." Karoline stepped outside to a roar of applause. Reporters surged forward. But she spoke only once. "This wasn't my victory. It was yours, and it's only the beginning." That night, as sirens wailed across elite neighborhoods and black sedans carried away the untouchable, one voice rose louder than any headline. The people, and at the center of it all, a 27-year-old woman who wore her cross, spoke her truth, and refused to back down, had shaken the system. And it would never be the same again. The courtroom was still buzzing with disbelief after Judge Richard Malloy had been handcuffed and led out of the room. A man once considered untouchable toppled by a 27-year-old woman armed only with the truth, the Constitution, and the courage to speak up. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't finished, not yet. As she stood before the stunned audience, a strange stillness settled in the room, the kind that comes right before a storm of change. Cameras rolled, reporters scribbled furiously, and the American people, from suburban kitchens to veterans' halls, from Mississippi to Montana, were watching. Karoline turned to the bench, now empty except for the American flag fluttering slightly from a ceiling vent. She looked at it with deep reverence, then slowly faced the public gallery. Her voice, when it came, wasn't angry but resolute, clear, and filled with something even more powerful than outrage, purpose. "This was never about me," she began, her voice amplified by the courtroom mic and instantly broadcast across every major network and streaming platform. "This is about every American who's been silenced, every young voice mocked, every senior citizen ignored, every veteran who's been denied, every person who ever walked into a courtroom and felt like they didn't matter." The crowd was silent, but you could see it in their eyes. They felt it. Her words weren't just spoken. They landed. Hard, deep. Karoline walked slowly toward the clerk's desk, lifted the stack of documents she had used to unravel the judge's corruption, and held them high. These aren't just files. They're stories of injustice, of broken faith in the system, of people who gave up thinking no one would ever listen. But someone did, and someone always will as long as we keep showing up. The camera zoomed in. A single tear rolled down the cheek of an older veteran in the third row. Franklin, 82, retired Marine Bronze Star, who hadn't cried in public since 1968. And yet here he was, breaking down, because in that moment someone finally said what needed to be said. Karoline stepped forward again. "You saw what happened today. We didn't need an army. We didn't need violence. We needed truth, courage, and the will to stand in the light when the world tells you to sit in the dark. And if I A 27-year-old woman from New Hampshire can take on a federal judge in his own courtroom and win, then so can you. The reaction was immediate and electric. Thunderous applause erupted from the back rows and swept forward like a tidal wave. Some were standing, some were crying, some were hugging people they'd never met, and outside the crowd that had been watching on giant screens began chanting, USA, USA. At that exact moment, phones across the country buzzed with breaking news alerts. Major news outlets had switched from cautious coverage to full-scale headlines. Leavitt topples corrupt judge sparks nationwide review. Truth prevails in federal court. Youngest press secretary in history becomes symbol of justice. But Karoline's work was only just beginning. She stepped outside the courthouse and was immediately swarmed by cameras and microphones. But instead of answering reporters' questions, she turned to the crowd. "We're forming the Liberty Integrity Initiative. It'll be a grassroots watchdog group run by everyday Americans for everyday Americans. Because no one should have to go through what we did alone." The cheer that followed nearly cracked the glass of the courthouse doors. That night, Karoline went back home to New Hampshire. She didn't fly back on Air Force One or ride in a motorcade. She took a train. Quiet. Simple. Alone. And yet not alone. Because in every diner she passed, every truck stop, every living room with the TV still on, people were watching her replay. Her voice, her fight, her courage. It resonated. Not just as politics, not just as spectacle, but as something rare in modern life. A reminder that one voice still matters. She sat by the window as the lights of the country flickered past, town after town, farm after farm, family after family. She thought about her grandfather, a WU2 vet. Her mother, who worked double shifts as a nurse. Her neighbors back home who'd stood by her when she first ran for office. And the people she met along the way, court clerks, whistleblowers, scared citizens who had finally found someone who listened. Karoline pulled out her notebook and began to write. Not a speech, not a press release, but a letter to the American people, a thank you letter. She ended it simply, "Let's keep going, for each other, for the truth, for America." And somewhere in homes all across the country, folks nodded. Because in the heart of this nation, in every red barn and blue collar, they knew it too. Something had changed. And it all started when one young woman refused to back down. In the days following Judge Richard Malloy's shocking arrest, America found itself gripped by a storm of questions, conversations, and consequences. The courtroom scene, a 27-year-old woman standing alone, yet unshaken while a federal judge was led away in handcuffs, had gone viral. Every network replayed the moment, every diner booth buzzed with disbelief, and every senior citizen center across the country saw folks gathering to talk, not about sports or weather, but about justice, about courage, and about a young woman who stood tall against corruption. Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, had done more than win a court case. She had awakened the conscience of a nation. The aftermath was unlike anything seen in modern judicial history. Over 3 million people signed an online petition within 72 hours demanding a full-scale audit of federal court appointments. Congressional leaders, under pressure from a wave of phone calls and letters, many written in shaky but determined cursive, from retirement homes and veterans' halls, called for an emergency oversight session. A special task force was formed, including retired judges, constitutional scholars, and citizen advocates, to review every decision linked to Judge Malloy over the past 10 years. Several of those decisions were overturned within weeks. As the momentum built, Karoline didn't take a break. Instead, she took the stage. Invited to speak at the University of Virginia School of Law, she delivered a fiery, heartfelt address titled, "Integrity Over Influence." Her message wasn't just about the legal system. It was about the American spirit. She spoke of her grandmother who fled communism in Eastern Europe and instilled in her the belief that freedom isn't free. It's defended every day, often in quiet, unnoticed ways. That speech, recorded and posted by a student, racked up 18 million views in 5 days. Even critics were forced to take a breath. Media personalities who once dismissed her as just a mouthpiece for the administration were now calling her conscience of a generation. An op-ed in the New York Times read, "We may not agree with her politics, but Karoline Leavitt has reminded us what principled leadership looks like." What made it even more astonishing was her humility. When asked by a reporter how it felt to be the face of reform, Karoline replied, "I'm not the face. I'm a voice. One of millions who love this country and are tired of seeing it twisted by power." But the story didn't end there. Inspired by the public's overwhelming response, Karoline proposed a national initiative, the Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act. The proposed legislation aimed to require mandatory public reviews of federal judges every 5 years, anonymous judicial feedback from attorneys, and open financial disclosures beyond what was currently required. Within a month, over 30 members of Congress co-sponsored the bill, a rare bipartisan moment in a deeply divided Capitol. And yet it was the quieter moments that spoke the loudest. In Concord, New Hampshire, where her journey had begun, an 84-year-old retired nurse named Eleanor wrote Karoline a letter by hand. In it, she said, "I never thought I'd live to see someone young stand up for what's right, not just for fame or fortune, but for truth. You made me proud to be an American again." That letter sat framed on Karoline's desk. By December, Karoline returned to the same courthouse where it had all started, not as a defendant, not even as a witness, but as a guest of honor. A new judge had been appointed. Court staff had changed. The biggest difference was the public gallery, filled not just with press, but with veterans, teachers, clergy, and seniors wearing red, white, and blue pins that read, "Truth Matters." She addressed them briefly, thanking them not for supporting her, but for standing up when it mattered most. Her voice, calm but charged with meaning, echoed through the chamber. This wasn't about me. It was about all of us. About reminding our institutions that they serve the people, not the other way around. As she stepped out into the crisp winter air, the courthouse bell struck noon. A small group of school children waved little American flags. A man in a wheelchair saluted, and Karoline, pausing for just a breath, looked up toward the sky, closed her eyes, and whispered, "We're just getting started." Her story became more than a political moment. It became a movement, one that reminded Americans, especially those who had lived long enough to know how fragile democracy can be, that the fight for justice, truth, and integrity never ends. And sometimes it only takes one brave voice to shake the whole system.